Hello and welcome all back to Election Time News. Now listen one second. I know this looks long, but don't worry. I set up YouTube chapters feature so you can skip ahead to whatever events you're interested in using the progress bar below. So today is Wednesday, December 31st, 2025. And today, in this video, we're going to be diving into the entire calendar year of 2025, going through one electoral event at a time. And remember, no matter the time, country, or scale, there's never a dull moment in politics. One quick note. Any references to current or incumbent are referring to the people in these positions at the date in context. Any and all statements made are factual, as checked by independent fact-checking sources, or deductions reached or hypothesized by political scientists as cited, or simple conclusions based on information such as polling, voting results, or other cited data. So, here we go into the beginning of the year, January 1st, 2025. So at this point in time, we have the incumbents of President Biden, Prime Minister Albanese, and Prime Minister Trudeau. 2 months prior to this, current Vice President Kamala Harris had faced a disappointing yet somewhat expected defeat at the hands of former President Donald Trump in the 2024 presidential general election. What was shocking wasn't necessarily the result itself, but the specifics, notably margins in states like Florida and Texas. Trump and current President Biden were well underway with the peaceful transfer of power, and the American people were completely on board as of this time. He was actually entering office with the positive approval rating, and Trump's approval rating was in the positives for the first time ever by mid-December the previous year. This starts in February, but before that it was even higher. So the electorate was excited to see what he had in store for them. And Paris was tied to the unpopular and tied to the incumbent President Joe Biden. Incumbents in the other two countries, Albanese and Trudeau, were facing similar issues. Dissatisfaction with their administrations was high, and in polling leading to the federal elections in both of these countries, the Labour and Liberal parties were looking like they were headed down into the dumpster. At this point in time in Canada, Trudeau was seeming to be looking ahead at a complete loss in the general election, and I gotta open the pages here. Going into the general federal election in Canada, for example, it wasn't looking very strong at all. Opinion polling was well up in the conservative superstorm area here. And in the election in 2025 with Peter Dutton, the same sort of thing was happening, where you had a strong coalition lead. Now, Trudeau was in worse condition than Albanese, however, terrifyingly low approval. The NDP almost tied with the Liberals for support, with a strong conservative majority government seeming more and more sure, and things weren't seemingly getting better. And so, with that, these two parties were basically just shutting down slowly and getting ready for the worst. Until January 20th came around. And so, on this day, two relatively big important things happened. After leading the Liberals for 12 years and Canada for 10, Justin Trudeau steps down as leader of the Liberal Party. On the same day, former President Donald Trump takes the oath of office for a second time, and these together, more so the first and the second, have an immediate and stark impact on the Liberals in Canada. The upcoming elections are looking less like a cobbled together coalition of chaos of the Greens, NDP, and Liberals versus a strong conservative majority, and more like a standard two-party led government that was in the air on who would control the legislature, which was the immediate trend over the next coming weeks. The main issue for this is that the minor parties, the new Democratic Party in particular, were getting hyped up at the possibility of setting themselves up as the future alternative to the collapsing Liberals, and Jagmeet Singh was setting it to potentially be the second largest party in the legislature for the first time since 2011. As Liberals recovered under Mark Carney, however, this vision started to waver and collapse, and the NDP seemed to be forced to retreat to third place yet again. The full scope of the losses that the NDP would face were yet to be realized at this point. It would continue to get worse and worse. Now, the Albanese's Labour Party was performing better, but still struggling. However, luckily for them, the coalition was having worse struggles, and these cracks were just starting to show in January. That was about their peak. Some of this stems from the unpopularity of the leader in Peter Dutton, but quite a bit of it was also, if you go into the specific polling, we can see that preferred prime minister was Albanese. Up until January, they were almost tied, but it was always in the average here, Albanese. And his approval rating was a bit actually worse than Dutton's, interestingly enough. But preferred prime minister was always Albanese. But difficulty in balancing the liberal and national platforms was beginning to wear already in the most critical time of the campaign as things were really heating up, and it immediately dampened the continued gains that the coalition had made over the past year and a half. The writs were established and the races were off, and the incumbent parties were bit by bit starting to build back up. So then, as January turned into February, and so things were heating up in these contests, you were seeing the Liberals in Canada and Labour in Australia were looking like better days were ahead. Their polling was doing better, especially the Liberal Party was skyrocketing, and Labour was starting to narrowly gain up, but mostly the coalition was collapsing in a bit of favor towards independents for the most part, and a little bit in trumpet of patriots, but that was roughly flat for the most part there. Recovering from the worst of it, which would have been absolutely critical for these parties to be able to hold on it to power for another cycle. The opposite was true for Trump, however. His actually finally positive approval rating, the +5 he started with, deteriorated to +2 by week 3, and it wasn't looking like it was going on a road to recovery. Meanwhile, Albanese was again consistently leading as preferred prime minister against Dutton, and it was getting better from here on out, ranging from +1 to +14, depending on the poll that you're looking at. Where's the table? There it is. +1 to +14 in some cases, and it was just getting worse for Dutton. Now, at some points, it really was actually Dutton in the lead, and there were some ties, but it was getting worse and worse as the polls continued. And also, Polyev was faring better in Canada to some extent, but his collapse was actually much more pronounced, going from, of course, decimating Trudeau to treading water versus Carney. And the Trump issue wasn't helping either, after continued statements on ideation of making Canada the 51st state, which Canadians greatly did not approve of. Carney took a much more aggressive stance against the United States than Polyev did, which may have appeared weak to many Canadians, being Polyev's position on the issue. This continued to taint his picture over the next few weeks as the election got closer and closer, and the campaign season was actually wrapping up. There was a lot more polling done, and it seemed increasingly that it was going to be a Liberal win, and this is generally through the generally accepted campaigning period. Glossing a bit over the specific play-by-plays of Australian and Canadian federal elections, over the following weeks, Liberals continued to gain and eventually reached the point of overtaking the Conservatives, mostly at the expense of the NDP, which almost completely tanks as the Liberals gain. And the coalition gave way to the Liberals in the primary vote. Not necessarily, though. They actually were still behind the coalition at the end, as well as ceding ground in the two-party preferred, especially, which the Labour Party did quickly gain in. They gained a lot of ground in New South Wales and in Victoria especially, and day by day was looking a bit less like a question of if and more by how much a Labour win, as the coalition struggled to then keep their coalition together and satisfied as they continued to struggle mostly internally. And yet in the midst of all this, as we now get through the month of March, now you have the main elections in America, three relatively important elections: Wisconsin Supreme Court race, which brought a lot of national attention, as well as special elections for Florida's 1st and 7th congressional districts to replace Gates and Walz, respectively. So Elon Musk put millions of dollars into and even made visits for the race in Wisconsin. And he made visits for the conservative-led candidate in Wisconsin, Brad Schimmel. Additionally, the fact that two R plus 15 districts in Florida were even necessarily being discussed in the first place, R plus 18 and R plus 14, did really just say to the change in the political climate just 3 months after Trump took office. This also just showed his immediate unpopularity and turnout dynamics in special elections continuing to shift back from the 2010 era, the Tea Party era, where Republicans were generally much stronger in these cycles, yet now you had Democrats benefiting from lower turnout. President Trump struggled to initialize his new term's agenda with the very restrictive victories he held in Congress, only 3 seats over control in the House and 2 over in the Senate. Whether this hurt his approval rating with failing to keep promises or actually helped it from tanking further may not be known, but either way, he lost his approval rating and went below water on March 8th. After this, he never again had a positive approval rating as of now, and only one of the 3 being of the main heads of state of the 3 countries to have this occur. On April 1st, election night, Democrats outperformed everywhere. They only lost the special House elections by 14.6 and 14.2 points, respectively, for the, I believe the 6th was worse than the 1st. And then, actually, that's 14.6, so 14.6% in the 1st district, and 14%, actually 13.99%, in the 1st, or in the 6th, and won in Wisconsin by a very considerable margin. Susan Crawford beat Brad Schimmel by a flat 10 points. That's 10.1%. Winning counties haven't gone blue presidentially, especially down in the Driftless area, since 2008, as well as the 3 counties here of Outagamie, Winnebago, and Brown. These overperformances were just the beginning of a larger pattern that continued relentlessly through the rest of the calendar year. And the most important thing from April 1st was in Florida 01, where, believe it or not, more registered Republicans voted than Jimmy Patronis got votes, which shows that Republicans were now voting across the aisle. Whether it was specifically Gay Valmont herself or something that would actually continue was still up in the air at this point early in the year. As the elections in the other 2 countries approached, things seemed more settled, but in Canada, the Conservatives had a last-minute surge. And this wasn't pulling almost up with the Liberals in the polls nationally. And so this left them in contention for government right up until election night. And so as they finally narrowly pulled up here at the very, very end and Liberals stalled, the same thing cannot be said for the coalition, as they basically just ended up flatlining and not losing any more ground, but they continued to fall and eventually did stay relatively consistent in the last few days of April. Now, Labour, on the other hand, was, of course, on the fast track to victory. Just how much was the question? Minority government, narrow majority, like 70 seats, maybe 80 or 90? Some closely contested seats were in contention until the very end. And so election night came in Canada, and the Liberals were doing very strong. The East was coming in fantastically, especially in regions that they needed to outperform in, and did very strong in these areas, being in, especially the Eastern Islands were looking strong with these first returns. However, British Columbia and Alberta had other ideas and stifled the thing that became plausible in 2 short months that early January Trudeau Liberals could only have dreamed of: a majority government. They ended up falling short by 3 seats, and the Conservatives took them home that would have been necessary for the Liberals to have a majority. But even then, the Liberals and Mark Carney would lead the country yet again in one of the greatest turnouts in one of the greatest turnarounds in the country's history. perhaps more surprising, was that Poilievre himself lost his own riding in Carleton, Ontario, perhaps the largest loss to party leadership since Dashley's loss in South Dakota Senate race in 2004 USA. This left the Conservatives without a leader in Parliament itself for a few months as they scrambled to assemble themselves and do an emergency autopsy. The NDP was arguably, if it were even possible, faring even worse, as having lost party status for the first time since 1993, and Singh lost his own seat, with the party dropping to only 7 seats total in the entirety of Parliament, their worst result ever. And perhaps most importantly for the Liberals was that Carney wasn't even the incumbent in Nepean, yet he did manage to win, so he'd be able to stand in that riding and preside over the new narrowly minority government, as they were only only 3 seats shy. So with a coalition of just some of the NDP and potentially the Greens, who was just Elizabeth May, they would be able to easily get enough support to run the country with relatively strong approval ratings right out of the gate as well. Just the following week, the Australian Labor Party had one of the best nights in its history, and one of only 4 times in Australian history that any group got more than 90 seats in the House of Representatives, and the only one in which it was done by a single party. The other 3 were done by the LNC, which is a coalition of parties, and tie for the most ever received, period, tying the coalition's 1996 win at 94. Anthony Albanese wrapped up the campaign season proudly, with also opposition leader Peter Dutton losing his own seat in Dixon, and Adam Bannon of the Greens losing his own seat, meaning Albanese was the only leader left standing. Now then, after this, things were a bit calm over the next few weeks. Primary campaigning was taking place in the United States for the 2025 contests, and the governments in Australia and Canada were getting ready to take effect. But then on May 19th, which was just a few days after the federal election, the coalition collapsed. And this was partially due to more instability, losing their leader, more instability after their complete devastating loss in the previous election. And then this coalition fractured the 80-year-long bond, snapping over disagreements and chaos after the destruction of the ballot box just weeks prior. Things were really getting interesting, however, in the progressivism movement, especially in the United States. Around this time, a new shining face in the was capturing the attention of millions in mid and late May of this year from New York City. Zoran Mamdani. A state assemblyman from an NYC district, he flung himself into the race for mayor going into the Democratic primary. And so here, he also challenged in this contest big shot Andrew Cuomo, the scandal-plagued former governor of the state as a whole. It seemed a long shot, but as time progressed, the race seemed to primarily be between the two of them and even be attainable by Mamdani. His social media presence and unabashed progressivism is what captivated citizens from the Everglades to the Hawaiian volcanoes, and it felt like a potential start of a revitalization of the weakened and still struggling Democratic Party since their absolute whooping in 2024, where they lost seats and just ground in general across the country. And while they did, of course, gain seats in the House in general, they gained a net 2, it still wasn't a result necessarily to be proud of, as well as their atrocious work in the presidential election. Now back to the mayor election here. At the same time, while the establishment Democratic leadership was still tanking in support amongst their own voters, where the Democratic Party approval rating was in the gutter, you then ended up with a new beacon that was looking like a new future and direction for the party as a whole. As Mamdani's poll numbers grew, fundraising goals were met and completely smashed through, and marketing improved as his social media picture began to bloom into a powerhouse. At the same time, Trump's issues with proposing public policy showed as the House had difficulty showing support for his landmark legislation, the Big Beautiful Bill. It was first introduced on May 20th, but it wouldn't even make it to the Senate until June 27th. 3 days before the introduction to the Senate floor, Mamdani would surprise many and defeat Cuomo in the NYC Democratic mayoral primary, and not by a marginal amount either, an entire 13 percentage points. Once all the ranked choice voting ballots were counted, shown here, he even won round one, which was not at all to be expected, and it was on every single poll had Cuomo winning at least the first round, and if anything, Mamdani would win the final round, which was not expected by almost any. This of what can almost only be described as a trouncing proves the more progressive Democrats were energized, especially young voters who turned out in absurd numbers, and he received the most votes ever received for a Democrat in the primary, with increased turnout. He then went instead, and Andrew Cuomo, instead of completely dropping out, then went on to run in the general. Then the Senate quickly made way with H.R. 1 and managed to get to the president's desk by his goal day of July 4th, despite many trials and issues of the Senate parliamentarian. Trump managed to have the House and Senate pass his big beautiful bill, being H.R. 1, continuing his tax cuts from his first term and increasing spending on government agencies such as ICE. And while support for the 800-page long bill was variable, it was signed into law nonetheless. After this debacle, the first surprise retirement was announced. Tom Tillis of North Carolina. He had issues with the Republican Party before, even being censured over his support for things like gay marriage and gun safety and laws in that vein, but also other issues such as his chronic underperformances in the Senate, where, for example, in 2020, he only won by 1.7% as an incumbent, only outperforming Donald Trump by, I believe, 0.4% against a very flawed Democrat. And so at this time, it was one of only 7 announced retirements in the entire country up to that point for the 2026 midterms, but many, many more would soon come. More Senate races would make themselves more interesting over the course of July, with former Senate candidate Colin Allred also announcing his running in the Senate race against incumbent John Cornyn in Texas, after losing to Ted Cruz in November 2024. He only lost this race by 8.5 points on the same ballot that Donald Trump won the state by 13, but whether this was actually due to Cruz's unlikability or Allred's potential strength is mostly indeterminable, as it's only one race, and we have seen how Cruz has underperformed before, only winning by 2.5 against, but also potential upstart and then somewhat failed star Beto O'Rourke in 2018. This was on the same ballot as strong overperformances for Democrats in other states, including holding on in states like West Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Montana, all 4 of those flipping in 2024. The following week, on July 8th, independent Dan Osborne announced he too was running again in 2026, like he had in 2024, having lost to the current Senator Deb Fischer by 6.7%. Now running against the more popular former governor turned senator Pete Ricketts, who won in a special election after Sassy left the Senate, and Ricketts then took over. He won that race by, as you can see, 25.25 points. He would likely use his campaign experience now and the bluer year than 2024, expected in 2026, to get over the 6.7-point margin he lost to Fisher by, to be the first independent, non-caucusing senator, because these Sanders and King are legally independents, but they caucus with Democrats, the first independent, non-caucusing member of the Senate, going all the way back to Virginia's Harry Byrd in 1976. As July continued, the snap election in Tasmania's campaign season began. The Liberals were hoping to finally build up a substantive government, as they had failed to do so for quite a while now. But having been a minority government and falling victim to a no-confidence vote yet again. But Labour was preparing to ride on the back of their national success just a few months earlier in the year and make some change in unexpected places. And so they were ramping up as well for this election. The end of July was a mess, mostly in America, as a lot more began to happen. Lara Trump announced her specific candidacy and then actually declined to do so in the Senate race in North Carolina. She declined to run. And then in that same race, in one of the best news that Democrats received all cycle, outgoing as of January, very popular Governor Roy Cooper was launching his Senate campaign in 2026, initially poised again to be against Lara Trump. And additionally, President Trump called upon the Texas legislature to draw him a more beneficial statewide U.S. House map, which was then relatively promptly passed, and this initiated a redistricting war that involved California governor and presidential candidate hopeful Gavin Newsom. And later in the month, Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers announced he would be generally following precedent and would not be seeking a third term, retiring the 2026 cycle and leaving this vital swing state open without an incumbent. Now, while generally not the most popular of all governors in the country, the environment and incumbency would have likely been enough to carry Evers to victory, who did himself defeat incumbent Governor Scott Walker back in 2018. But the field immediately opened up nonetheless, with Lieutenant Governor Rodriguez taking the primary spotlight and making this race a lot more interesting going into 2026. Tasmania then on the 19th delivered a verdict that not all Liberals nationwide were completely doomed after the abysmal May election. They gained 3% in the statewide vote, and while they didn't gain any seats, they didn't lose any either, leaving the next government suspended in midair yet again, as volatile as it was before. One more thing of note in July was the Democratic primary for the special election in Arizona's 7th District, with the daughter of the recently deceased Congressman Adelita Grijalva running against Deja Fox, a younger, more progressive candidate. In what was some saw as a continuation of the potential progressivization of the Democratic Party. And so with this came a lot of potential contention and excitement for her, but it ended up being that it was almost entirely just online hype, as on the July 15th primary, a very status quo result ended up taking place, as Grijalva, with the support of countless endorsements and campaign infrastructure from her father, easily won, winning 61.5% of the vote against Fox's 22 1/3. And then July turned into August, and the 2025 races were heating up very, very quickly. Virginia was now poised to have its first ever female governor, with both parties' candidates being actually being women. Current incumbent Lieutenant Governor Winsome Earl Sears versus former U.S. House Representative Abigail Spanberger. And New Jersey's 2021 Republican nominee Jack Ciattarelli was facing off against New Jersey's 11th Congressional District Representative Mikey Sherrill. And while in years past Virginia was the more competitive, especially looking back in 2021, actually being more so, and also looking back in presidential years for quite some time, the margins have been considerably closer, going back to the time where Virginia was a Republican state. This time it was looking the other way around. Even though Harris only won New Jersey by 5.9%, and the lackluster performance for incumbent Governor Phil Murphy in 2021, where he only won against Ciattarelli by 3.25%. It seemed the latter was the main focus over the former, especially as the gap between Spanberger and Earl Sears seemed to grow with every single poll. Then another huge bit of news came for the Democrats in the form of former Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio, who narrowly lost his race, overperforming Harris by over almost 10 points to Bernie Moreno by 3.6% in 2024. He announced his bid against unelected incumbent John Husted in Ohio for the remainder of J.D. Vance's term, which would only be 2 years, on August 12th. And the blistering August months brought not much else other than the continued decay of incumbent approval ratings in all three nations, but none quite as harsh as for Donald Trump, which was now sitting at minus 14. And yet, special elections continue to pile up in the United States, one Democratic overperformance after the other. Now, if we look at some of these specific elections here, the state house, almost all of these were Democratic overperformances, some by relatively colossal amounts, continuing over the course of the month of August. And it was increasingly painting a turquoise picture of 2026, one that the RNC was absolutely dreading. The rest of August was generally slow, but more small elections continued, as well as some more significant ones. For example, on September 9th, we had a race in the Virginia's 11th Congressional District to fill former Representative Jerry Connolly's seat. And in this race, you had a relatively large overperformance here, won by James Walkinshaw, being against Stuart Whitson. While a safely Democratic seat, Connolly only won by 34 points in 2024, and Walkinshaw then stormed the seat with a margin of over 50%, a 16-point swing to the Democratic Party. And while turnout dynamics did definitely help, these margins were more than expected by any metric. Additionally, Iowa Democrats shattered the Republican supermajority in the state, in the state legislature, by flipping the first state Senate district with Caitlin Dray on August 26th, a bit later in the month, defeated Republican Christopher Prosch by 10.5% in a seat that went for Rocky DeWitt by 10.4 in 2022, as he defeated Democratic incumbent Jackie Smith. Back before that, it was a differently drawn district, but she won relatively considerably and defeated him soundly, which was the first true sign that there were levels of things going on, even enough to be able to change the composition of state governments. The races in Virginia and New Jersey heated up over the course of September, and this was not going to cool down at any point either. They would continue to get considerably a bit more interesting over the next month and a half as the fundraising goals were met and surpassed by both candidates, and more attention was being brought to these races. So then we have the races not only in these two states, but also California's Proposition 50, which was an amendment to temporarily give the districting ability to the specifically set it to a certain map and take it from the nonpartisan redistricting committee for a few years until 2030, when it would be restored to the redistricting committee for the 2030 census cycle. Republicans, hoping to hold on to their 5-seat gain in Texas while not losing 5 in California, spent millions of dollars on advertising to get the proposition defeated. Additionally, again, Andrew Cuomo, despite losing to Mamdani in the primary, did launch a general campaign in the New York City general election for mayor. He launched an independent campaign under the Fight and Deliver ticket. He did remain a registered Democrat through the entire campaign. Unfortunately for Republican Curtis Sliwa, who was already generally a long shot bid in a blue region like NYC, having lost to incumbent Eric Adams by 45 points in 2021, it was looking more and more like he would be completely trapped out of the race unless Cuomo and Mamdani split the Democratic vote enough that he could win in the first past the post system. Mostly the 2025 picture was looking like a gubernatorial trade of sorts, where in this environment you could potentially have Democrats picking up Virginia, but New Jersey was looking too close for comfort for Democrats, while they were looking like they would take Virginia home. This brought more attention to New Jersey, a complete flip of 2021, and it was looking like Cettarelli could take this race home for the Republicans this time, as opposed to narrowly losing against Murphy in 2021. Then was September 23rd, 2025, and Arizona's 7th congressional district went for Adelita Grijalva. She went on to win the general by 40 points in the seat that her father won by 27 11 months prior, a 13-point swing, not quite as considerably strong as in some other regions, but again, a double-digit overperformance for a special election. It was at this time the discussions in the RNC were being leaked about preparing for a 2026 blue hurricane if the trends didn't reverse, and relatively quickly at that, as now we were down to 14 months before the midterms, which in electoral terms is both a long time and no time at all. As October started, another retirement that had happened prior became more and more prominent and definitely something of concern for the Republicans. Mark Green in Tennessee's 7th District, which Green won by 21.5% in 2024. The primaries taking place on the 7th of the month painted a golden picture for Democrats. Only 5,000 more Republicans turned out to the primaries than Democrats, meaning if their turnout game worked well enough, they could pull out the race in a nail-biter. This race quickly heated up further as early polls did show Democrats in a single-digit contest. Then more general election news here. Janet Mills announced that she would be joining the primary field for Senate, and you also had running likely against the incumbent Susan Collins, the only Republican in 2026 defending a seat that Kamala Harris won in 2024. In that same week, more new faces with a lot of promise, akin to this point in 2017 with Beto O'Rourke, were making noise. State Representative James Tallarico, running for U.S. Senate in Texas, broke the quarterly fundraising record in the state in just 3 weeks. Democrats were energized and were getting ramped up going into the heat of the 2025 cycle. And so it was looking more and more competitive as things were going on, and it was clear that Republicans were not, as Earl Sears' numbers continued to fall in Virginia, and Chattarelli's climb stalled out completely when he needed to be foot on the gas completely. As October then came to a close in the month, we also had more developments in the race for the gerrymandering. And so you had in Utah more maps be proposed and shot down. You had contention in Indiana as well. And then you actually had more discussions on how things should go in Proposition 50 later in the year, as well as many other states deciding to participate as well. Then, as October came to a close, Republicans dropped out eventually on Proposition 50 entirely. And so its polling was a sturdy 20 points or higher in the net positives in almost every single poll, including Republican aligned ones. And as early voting started in the two gubernatorial races, it seemed more and more futile for attempts and efforts in Virginia. Republicans were going full force in New Jersey. And so they were both continuing to try to win both of them. And Chattarelli was getting the early vote returns in the counties he needed, especially the one Republican stronghold in the state, Ocean County. New York City was looking intriguing. Mamdani was narrowly ahead of Cuomo, but Sliwa was performing well for himself, about 20% in some polls. And Pennsylvania was another story, with 3 liberal-leaning judges up for retaining elections. Republicans wanted a chance to flip the court in the critical swing state. They launched a heavy do not retain campaign, especially going heavy on television advertising in the last few weeks of the election season, which then brought the Democrats pushing right back. Then it seemed way too quick once it actually came, and it was election night. Early in the night, Virginia started coming in first, and Spanberger was taking a very strong lead that was completely unforgiving and held it firm. Earl Sears never really got the traction she needed in the deep red rural areas, and especially didn't get anywhere near what she needed in the suburbs that carried Youngkin to victory 4 years prior. Loudoun County especially betrayed Republicans. After being the sign that Youngkin would win in 2021 and Trump would do well enough in the suburbs to win entirely in 2024, Spanberger promptly won it by just shy of 30%. And even scandal-ridden Jay Jones defeated incumbent Attorney General Jason Miyares by more than Kamala Harris won the state by in 2024. Spanberger's final margin was 15.4% in a race that was expected to be quite a bit closer, most having it right around a 10%, maybe a little bit more than that, but for the most part sitting right around 10%, where she then got 3 halves that expected margin, showing again continued rejection of the Republican Party in this era, even though, believe it or not, it was actually lower turnout, but that does tend to end up helping Democrats. Perhaps more surprising than this, however, was in New Jersey. And so at this time, where it was looking like it was going to be very, very competitive, the final polls had them neck and neck, and the final Atlas Intel poll only had Mikey Sherrill up by 1, said to be one of the greatest pollsters. SoCal Strategies had 7, Suffolk by 4, Research Co. by 3, almost all of the aggregates were at plus 5. And then Sherrill stormed the map, winning counties that hadn't gone blue since 2017, and ended up winning that race almost by as much as Spanberger, where she then almost received 1.9 million votes, way higher turnout. Interestingly enough, Jack Chattarelli received more votes than Phil Murphy did 4 years prior, yet still got completely decimated due to the 11 percentage point higher turnout in this election due to the increased national attention in the race. Cheryl was able to completely win her congressional district by absurd amounts. She even won Keehan's district, which is going to be competitive in 2026, throwing a waving flag to that as well for the Democrats. And then you finally have the race in New York City, where you ended up with, surprisingly enough, a very narrow victory for Zoran Mamdani. He was actually the smallest Democratic victory that night, winning by only 9.5 points, and barely crossing 50% in the final tally. The turnout was actually up by 20 percentage points, mostly due to very increased youth turnout, which definitely helped Mamdani. And he actually barely won. You actually have, interestingly, congressional state assembly. You can see these regions that Cuomo did relatively well in as well, but narrowly, every single precinct was won by either Cuomo or Mamdani, which is relatively surprising considering how Sliwa was originally expected to get only maybe up to 15%. We ended up only getting half that in the final polls, or in the final result. And Pennsylvania resoundingly retained all three of their judges, doing so by more than current Governor Josh Shapiro won the state by in his very impressive victory in 2022, where he won by 15% against very deeply flawed candidate Doug Mastriano, and winning counties that he lost, and including counties that he lost by double digits as well. Areas like Cambria County was won by one of them. I don't know why the difference in some of these. Northumbria County was won by Doherty. Columbia County as well. Pike County, Washington, and Westmoreland, and multiple other counties, including relatively rural ones like York and Lancaster, which Shapiro narrowly lost against Mastriano. California's Proposition 50 ended up passing by more than Joe Biden won the state by in 2020, and did better with Hispanic voters than Hillary Clinton in 2016, in especially areas like the heavily Hispanic regions of Los Angeles, which shows a glimmer of hope for the Democrats in these demographic groups. Perhaps most surprisingly is that 2 Republican congressmen's seats turned on them, voting yes on Prop 50, being Valadao and Calvert's seats. Both voted yes on Proposition 50. The largest victory by far, however, for the Democrats, as far as our performances go, would come in the form of 25-point wins in Georgia for the Georgia Public Service Commission seats, which were the first time Democrats won any statewide non-federal offices in Georgia at all since 2006, and both of them defeated incumbents. This foretold that Senator Jon Ossoff would have almost nothing to worry about going into his 2026 re-election campaign as he continued to perform strongly, and this very low turnout election, as believe it or not, the better of the two performing, Peter Hubbard, received less votes in this race than the losing Senate candidate back in 2016, Barksdale, did against Johnny Isaacson in that Senate race, which he lost by 13 percentage points. Even back in 2010, a very poor year for Democrats, Mike Thurmond received narrowly more votes than Hubbard. So again, it tells a tale about low turnout versus how these races will go. But yet again, seeing these candidates, especially with how they won 3 Republican strong congressional districts, including 2 of candidates that are retiring to run for governor in Georgia in 2026, it could potentially open them up for some slight competition due to cities in the region. But then, after November 4th, all eyes turned to Tennessee's 7th Congressional District, and this was potentially going to be the final competitive race in the entire calendar year. Now, the state representative, Afton Bain, the Democrat, versus Commissioner of the Tennessee Department of General Services, Matt Van Epps. As the campaign went on, the race seemed to tighten. There were only 3 main polls done, 2 of them being Republican or Democratic, 10 points and 8 points. And then it actually went on to get even close. The final poll, being released 2 weeks before the election, only had Epps ahead by 2, which was relatively absurd in a House district that again had voted for the incumbent by 21.5 points in 2024. Now, that final poll did turn out to relatively be a strong miss, as Epps would end up winning by 8.84%, still a strong underperformance of Green's margin in 2024 by 12.61%. This continued the pattern of overperformances, interestingly, with most of them falling in the 10 to 15% range. It also showed support in the exurbs trending to Democrats, a pattern that began in previous cycles but slowly began to present itself, especially in areas like Montgomery County and especially in these counties, being of Williamson and Montgomery counties, which both were very heavily for Trump in 2020 and 2024. Yet now they are potentially a bit more competitive, especially also with Davidson County showing out very strongly for Bain in very blue numbers that hadn't been seen the same in 2024, where these are much more toned down blues. Right before the final election of the year, a few news bits dropped, mostly the trading of Colin Allred in Texas for the House Representative Jasmine Crockett in Texas, which was potentially a relatively poor choice, but still going to make the Senate election in Texas in 2026 be competitive. And so here, running for the Senate there, Colin Allred withdrew to run for the U.S. House, which took place on the 8th of December, and Jasmine Crockett then announced her Senate bid later that day, which was relatively highly speculated that she would, but was not completely known yet. That would be against James Tallarico for the Democratic nomination for the U.S. Senate seat. The Republican side, though, is also heavily contested, with incumbent John Cornyn going up against Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton and Texas 30th Congressional District Representative Wesley Hunt. The final capstone race of 2025, though, was the Miami mayoral runoff election. And this was the initial election, took place on general election night, and Democrat Eileen Higgins ran on against Republican Emilio Gonzalez. On the night of December 9th, Higgins was projected the winner within almost 5 minutes of the polls closing, being another continued very strong performance for the Democrats against Republicans across the country. And this flipped the mayorship for the first time since 1997. Additionally, she won by a whopping 20 points in a city that only voted for Kamala Harris by a bit over 1%, again showing that trend in the 10 to 15 point range, this time being by a lot more than that. And that took place on the 9th. She won by about 7,000 votes and 19 percentage points. Since this election, more news has dropped as well, and it's been continued back and forth for potentially vying for races for the 2026 cycle. Eileen Higgins was projected the winner. And then you had former NYC mayor candidate Brad Lander announcing his campaign for New York's 10th district, the beginning of what is potentially to be a sort of attempt of a Democratic Tea Party against the incumbent in that House district, being the 10th district in New York, going from the left and challenging Goldman, who won very comfortably in actually what was the bluest result for any candidate in New York's House delegation in 2024. Additionally, former Senator Doug Jones announced his candidacy for the Alabama mayorship, and now, interestingly, with the fact that incumbent senator of the state, Tommy Tuberville, it will end up being a rematch between the two, a rematch of the Senate election that Jones lost by 20% in 2020, a strong overperformance as the incumbent at the time after winning in an upset special election at the tail end of 2017. Additionally, then, Conservatives in Canada lost an MP in Ontario. Michael Ma changed from the Conservative caucus to the Liberal Party, bringing the Liberals to one seat short of a majority government. And while not being anything seismic, it would still make Mark Carney's job just a little bit easier as the year comes to a close and a budgeting crisis was narrowly averted weeks earlier. Then, in the second half of December, presumptive Republican nominee Elise Stefanik dropped out of the race for governor of New York after polling had her over 15 points behind incumbent Kathy Hochul in some cases. Hochul, again, was also not necessarily the most popular, and she was probably being challenged again due to her very poor performance in 2022, only winning by 6.5 against House Representative Lee Zeldin. But now things are looking much better for Hochul, and it's also expected to be a much, much bluer environment as a whole. This also leaves her House seat somewhat vulnerable in 2026, as it is a 24-point seat, and R plus 12 is probably barely enough to potentially make things a bit interesting. Still, redder than green seats, so that likely will not flip, but it could make things somewhat interesting in New York's 21st, depending on the candidate. On the 23rd, Elections Alberta approved a referendum question for leaving and separating from Canada, which will be taking place on a ballot in the 2026 calendar year. This somewhat shocking referendum question will potentially have face challenges in the courts. Stefanik wasn't then the only Republican who dropped out late in the year. You then had also a dropout by Bryce Reeves, who was the only true big name of any scale Republican who was challenging three-term incumbent Mark Warner in the Senate, who now has little to no challenge in being reelected in what he says will be his final term in the chamber. He himself outperformed Joe Biden by 2 points, even on the same ballot of his colossal 10-point win in 2020, and he even managed to narrowly hold on in 2014, beating former governor, I believe, Gillespie, in 2014 on the same ballot that Republicans swept everywhere, even winning in places like Colorado, and flipped Democratic seats in Montana, South Dakota, Iowa, Louisiana, Arkansas, Alaska, and North Carolina. And now then we reach today, December 31st, 2025. This year has many twists and turns in the world of electoral politics, and we've been here to cover it all. So now make sure to subscribe to the channel if you have not already, and feel free to leave video ideas and what you want to see more of in the comments. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video. We will absolutely be doing one of these each and every year, and it should be more developed, more polished. I did kind of throw this together relatively quickly. And so they should be much more polished in the year for next year. To recap the previous year in politics, here goes to 2025 and to another year ahead in 2026. And so now, again, as we're heading into this, whether you're in America, Australia, or Canada, thank you again so much for watching, for participation. It's been phenomenal watching the channel grow over the past year as well. And as always, have a phenomenal rest of your day and an amazing, prosperous new year.